Imagine standing on a train platform, alone. The wind is cutting through you like a blade. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, the kind that makes you forget who you are. The kind that strips everything warm from your body and leaves you standing there, hollow, in the bones of your own life. Now imagine that every single person you ever loved is gone. Your father, gone. Your mother, gone. Your home, gone. Your name, stripped of everything it once meant. You have one suitcase, you have 12 cents, and you have a train that just left without you. That is where we find Evelyn Mercer on the morning of December the 3rd, 1888. She is 26 years old. She is brilliant. She is proud. And she is standing on the snow-dusted platform of Timberline Station, the very last stop before civilization surrenders entirely to the Cascade Range, with absolutely nowhere left to go. But here is what I want you to understand before we begin. She doesn't know it yet. She has no idea. But standing at that very same platform, tucked in the shadows near the freight stacking boards, is a man. A mountain of a man, wrapped in animal hides, stitched together so crudely, the whole town calls him a beast. His beard is so thick with frost, it is turned to ice at the tips. His hands are the size of a woodcutter's block, cracked from cold and calloused from years of mountain stone. The town calls him Scruffy Silas. They say he lives like an animal. They say he is dangerous. They say he is the last man on earth a woman of any standing should ever trust. But when Evelyn Mercer looked into his eyes, those deep, quiet, knowing eyes, she saw something the whole town had been too blind to see. She saw dignity, and she made the most important decision of her life. She said yes. Welcome to Alea Duke Stories. I am so glad you are here today. If you are new to this channel, welcome to the family. This channel is built for people who believe that love is worth fighting for, that strength hides in the most unexpected places, and that the most beautiful kingdoms in the world are the ones built from heartbreak and hope. Today's story is called The Hidden Kingdom. This is a story about what happens when a woman who has lost everything finds a man hiding everything, and together, in the frozen wilderness of the highest mountains, they build something the world has never seen. Get comfortable, get cozy, because this is going to be a long and beautiful ride. The marshal's name was Harold Finch. He was not a cruel man, not exactly. He was a frontier man, a man shaped by the logic of survival and the cold mathematics of a mountain town that could not afford sentiment. He wore a gray coat with a tin star pinned above his breast pocket, and he spoke with the flat, measured delivery of someone who had delivered bad news too many times to feel it anymore. He found Evelyn Mercer at exactly 7:30 in the morning. She was still standing on the platform, her single leather suitcase at her feet, watching the tail of the eastbound train disappear around the bend in the mountain. She had not moved. She had not cried. She simply stood there, her dark hair pinned beneath a wool hat that had seen better winters, her gray eyes fixed on the empty rail like she was trying to will the train back through sheer force of refusal. "Miss," said Marshal Finch, stopping a respectful 3 feet away. "You the woman from the 640? Evelyn turned slowly. "I was on the 640, she said, her voice remarkably steady for someone standing alone in the December cold, with 12 cents in her coat pocket. "The conductor informed me my ticket was issued on a bank draft that has since been declined." "He put me off the train." Finch nodded once, slowly. He had heard this story before. The mill collapse back east had sent tremors through the banking system all the way out to the territories. He wasn't surprised. "You got family in Timberline?" he asked. "No." "You got work lined up?" "No." "You got means?" A pause. A long, dignified pause. "No," she said finally. Finch removed his hat, held it against his chest, and looked at her with something that might have been pity if the mountain wind hadn't blown most of his softness away years ago. "Then I'm sorry to be direct with you, Miss Mercer. Evelyn Mercer. Miss Mercer. The ordinance in Timberline is very clear. Unattached women without employment or local family cannot remain in town. We've had situations. The town council passed the law 3 years back, and I'm bound to enforce it." He replaced his hat. "I can put you on the next eastbound in 4 days. You can wait in the boarding house at your own expense." "Or," he stopped. "Or," Evelyn pressed. Finch looked uncomfortable for the first time. He turned slightly, gesturing with 2 fingers toward the far end of the platform, near the freight board. Or there's the matter of Silas. Evelyn looked, and there, in the shadows, she saw him for the first time. He was enormous. She registered that first. The sheer scale of him, the way he took up space, not with arrogance, but with a kind of ancient, unmovable stillness, like a boulder that had been there long before the town and would be there long after it. He wore layers of hide, elk, she would later learn, and some wolf, stitched with heavy sinew in long, rough seams that no tailor would ever claim. His hair was black and hung past his shoulders, matted at the ends. His beard was the same, copper dark at the roots and silver frosted at the tips, where the cold had claimed it. He was watching her, not leering, not threatening, simply watching, with those eyes, dark, still, impossibly calm. "His name is Silas," Finch said, lowering his voice as though the man could hear them from 40 feet away in a howling wind. "Town calls him Scruffy Silas. He's been coming down off the high ridge for supplies about once a month for near 5 years now. Nobody knows exactly where he lives up there. Nobody's been able to follow him. Finch paused, searching for a word that wouldn't come. He's got some peculiarities. Such as? Such as he doesn't talk much. Such as he carries things up that mountain that would break a mule. Such as he came in last week and told Thomas at the general store he'd be willing to take on a wife if anyone was in need of a situation. Said he could provide shelter, warmth, and food. Said it like he was ordering flour." Finch shook his head. "Nobody's taken him up on it, but the offer stands." Evelyn Mercer looked at the man at the end of the platform for a long, quiet moment. Every sensible instinct she possessed told her to say no. He looked like something out of a folk story, the kind told to frighten children into staying on marked paths. He smelled of pine smoke from where she was standing. He had said nothing, made no move toward her, offered no introduction. He simply stood in the cold, like the mountain itself had sent a representative. But then, he shifted his weight, and in that small movement, that single adjustment of a large man in the cold morning light, she saw something none of the other women had stayed long enough to see. He was waiting, not impatiently, not hungrily, just patiently, quietly, respectfully waiting, the way a person waits who has learned that the best things in life cannot be rushed or forced or demanded. He was waiting to see what she would do. Evelyn picked up her suitcase. She walked across the platform. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the detail of the stitching on his coat, and tilted her chin up to look him in the eye. "I am Evelyn Mercer," she said. "I am educated, organized, and I work hard. I have 12 cents to my name, and no prospects I am willing to accept on the eastern side of these mountains. I do not know what your life is like up there." She glanced toward the white peaks looming behind him. "And I cannot promise you that I will not have questions and opinions about it. But I will be honest with you, and I will carry my own weight." He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, in a voice that was low and unhurried and faintly, impossibly educated, the voice of someone who had read more books than this entire town had ever seen, "My name is Silas. I will carry the trunk." The ceremony took 5 minutes. Judge Alderman performed it over the wood stove in the jailhouse, with Marshal Finch and the blacksmith's apprentice as witnesses, because no one else in Timberline Station was willing to stand up for Scruffy Silas on his wedding day. Evelyn signed the register in a firm, clear hand. Silas signed beside her, and when she glanced at his signature, something small and strange moved through her chest. The handwriting was extraordinary, precise and elegant and architectural, each letter constructed with the deliberate care of someone who treated even a signature as a thing worth doing beautifully. She filed the observation away. Outside, in the frozen December morning, Silas hoisted her heavy trunk onto his massive shoulders as if it weighed nothing, tucked it there with one arm, and held out his other hand to show her the path. Evelyn Mercer, née Mercer, now bearing the name of a man she had known for less than 1 hour, looked back at the town of Timberline Station for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked into the mountains. The forest claimed them within minutes. One moment they were walking the packed earth road at the edge of Timberline Station, the smoke of chimneys visible behind them, the distant bang of the blacksmith's hammer still audible. Then the pines closed in, tall, ancient, dark-needled giants whose boughs had caught so much snow that the light beneath them turned blue and hushed and cathedral-like. Evelyn had walked in forests before. But she had never walked in this forest. It was not merely large. It was alive in a way that pressed against your awareness, that made you feel simultaneously very small and very watched. The trees were old beyond reckoning. Their trunks were wide enough that 3 people could not encircle them with linked arms. The snow beneath their feet was deep and undisturbed, except for the single trail Silas followed with utter certainty, as though he had walked it 1,000 times in the dark, which, she would later learn, he had. She watched him as they walked. She had always been an observer. It was the quality her father had admired most in her, and the one her creditors had least appreciated. She watched people the way architects watch buildings, looking for the structure beneath the surface, the logic that made a thing hold together or fall apart. Silas was a puzzle she had not expected. He was, of course, enormous. But enormous people often moved clumsily, compensating for their size with a kind of resigned heaviness. Silas moved like water moving downhill, continuously, efficiently, without waste. Each footfall was precisely placed. Each shift of the heavy trunk on his shoulder was adjusted with a small, unconscious precision that told her his body understood load-bearing in a way that went beyond instinct. He read the mountain the way she read ledger books. "There?" he said suddenly, the first word he had spoken since leaving town. He stopped, and without any other warning, changed their direction completely, angling 15 degrees to the left and beginning to ascend a gentle slope that was invisible until you were standing on it. "Why?" Evelyn asked, because she had promised herself she would not pretend to understand things she didn't. He was quiet for a moment, still walking, and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The main trail has a false shelf ahead, ice under 3 inches of powder. A person who doesn't know it is there goes through, drops 6 feet onto granite." She looked back at the trail they had just left. It looked completely ordinary. "How do you know?" she asked. "The way the snow settles," he said. "The temperature, the angle of light." He paused. "The mountain has a language. Most people don't stay still long enough to learn it." Evelyn absorbed this. "You've been living up here for 5 years?" she asked. "About that. Alone?" A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. "Yes." "And before that?" He did not answer immediately. She watched his shoulders, those enormous, deceptively calm shoulders, and saw the faintest, almost imperceptible tension move through them and then release. "East," he said finally. "A long time ago." She let it sit. She was not a woman who pushed where pushing was not yet welcome. She understood that trust was a structure. You could not rush the foundation and expect the walls to hold. Instead, she said, "The valley you live in, is it far? Today? In this weather?" He looked up at the sky, reading it the way she might read a clock. 6 hours, if it stays clear." She nodded. "And if it doesn't stay clear?" Another pause. "Then we find shelter and we wait." They walked for 2 hours in a companionable silence that surprised her more than anything else about the morning. She had expected awkwardness, the grinding social discomfort of 2 strangers thrown together by desperation and law. Instead, there was simply quiet, the mountain quiet, the kind that asks nothing of you and gives you, unexpectedly, room to think. She thought about her father, who had built the mill that collapsed. She thought about the creditors who had arrived like crows before the smoke had even cleared. She thought about the train journey west, which had lasted 11 days and felt like a slow funeral. She thought about the signature in the jailhouse register, that handwriting. "Silas," she said. Where did you study?" He stopped walking. She stopped walking. He turned his head and looked at her. Not the whole body turn of a man caught out, but a slow, sideways assessment, like a mountain considering an unexpected weather system. "What makes you think I studied anywhere?" "Your handwriting," she said simply. "I saw it in the register. It's the handwriting of someone trained in architectural drafting. The letter angles, the proportion. My father employed 3 men who wrote exactly that way. They had all trained under the same system." The silence that followed was enormous and had weight to it, and she let it exist without filling it. Silas turned back to the path. He began walking again, and after a long, long moment, he said, very quietly, as though the words cost him something, "I studied, yes, that was all." But she heard everything in it. The storm came in the early afternoon, without much warning. One moment the sky above the tree line was pale and clear, the white of winter bone. The next, A bank of cloud rolled in from the northwest with the speed and inevitability of an avalanche, dark gray at the leading edge, blue-black at its heart, carrying with it a wind that dropped the temperature so suddenly Evelyn felt the cold strike her face like an open hand. Silas felt it first. He had already slowed his pace, and she saw him tilt his head, that characteristic stillness of his, reading the air, before the first real gust arrived. "We need shelter," he said. "Now. How far is—" "Too far. Come." She had always trusted competent people quickly, and incompetent people never. And in this, at least her instincts had never failed her. She followed him without argument, up a steepening slope where the trees began to thin and the granite began to show through the snow in long, dark ribs. He moved faster now, and she worked to match him, her skirts dragging in the deepening powder, her breath coming in sharp white clouds. The wind hit the open slope full force, and she staggered against it, and without looking back, Silas's arm came out and caught her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was completely certain, completely unhurried. He did not let go. He kept his hand on her elbow for the rest of the climb, guiding her through the rocks, and she noticed, in some detached part of her mind that apparently refused to stop observing even in a blizzard, that he adjusted his path constantly to keep her sheltered behind him from the worst of the wind. He was using his own body as a windbreak, without comment, without ceremony. The shelter was a cliff overhang, a massive ledge of granite that jutted 10 feet out from the mountain face, creating a deep, dry alcove large enough for 3 people. It faced southeast, away from the northwest wind, and the rock walls on 3 sides muffled the howl of the storm to something distant and manageable. Silas set the trunk down and immediately began building a fire with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times in worse conditions. His hands found flint and a small steel from his coat pocket. He scraped together dry pine needles and moss from the back of the overhang, the one spot the snow had never reached, and within 4 minutes, with the precision of a man who wasted nothing, he had a small, hot, perfectly engineered fire burning in a natural stone depression that apparently existed for exactly this purpose. He had clearly used this shelter before. Evelyn settled beside the fire, pulling off her wet gloves and holding her hands out to the heat. For several minutes they simply sat in the warmth, listening to the storm build beyond the overhang's edge, the mountain growing louder, wilder, more absolute. "This happens often?" she asked. "In December?" "Yes." He added a piece of wood to the fire with the same careful attention he gave everything. "This storm will last 4 to 6 hours. We'll move again at dusk, or tomorrow morning if it's bad." She nodded. Then, "Do people know you're intelligent?" He looked at her. She looked back steadily. "In town. Does anyone there know that you are not what you appear to be?" Something moved across his face that she had no name for yet. It was not quite pain, and not quite amusement, and was in fact a precise mixture of both. The expression of a person who has grown accustomed to a particular loneliness. "They see what they expect to see," he said finally, "and you don't correct them." "No? Why?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough for the fire to shift and resettle. The storm outside had reached full voice now, howling, hammering, absolute. But inside the overhang, the firelight was warm and gold, and there was something intimate in the containment of it, the way the rock walls held the heat and the light close. "Because," he said at last, "what I was, and where I was, and everything that went with it, it cost me more than I had to spend." He turned the piece of wood in the fire with a careful hand. "Up here, no one expects anything. No one measures you against your credentials, or your family name, or the portfolio of your work. The mountain doesn't care who you were. It only cares whether you know what you're doing." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, in a way she hadn't allowed herself yet. Beneath the beard and the frost and the animal hides, the structure of his face was something remarkable. Strong jaw, clear forehead. And those eyes, even in firelight, even after everything, those eyes were the eyes of a person who had once loved the world and still, despite everything, retained some irreducible tenderness toward it. "I understand that feeling," she said quietly. He looked at her now. "My father built the largest textile mill in Worcester County," she said. "When it failed, when the walls literally came down, they took everything. The house, the accounts, the furniture. My mother had passed 2 years before, so it was only me left to watch it go. She paused. I was not only stripped of wealth, I was stripped of my name. In Worcester County, a Mercer who couldn't pay her debts was not a Mercer at all. So I left, and kept leaving until there was nowhere left to go." End quote. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the mountain roared, and in the firelit warmth of that stone sanctuary, two people who had each been reduced to nothing sat across from each other and understood, without any further explanation, exactly what the other had survived. Silas said quietly, "You have a very precise mind." "Yes," she agreed, "and you're not afraid of much." "I'm afraid of a great many things," she corrected. "I've simply stopped letting that be the deciding factor." He almost smiled. She saw it, just at the corner of his mouth, just for a second, almost immediately suppressed, as if he'd caught himself doing something he'd forgotten he was allowed to do. She filed that away too. By midnight, the storm had become something elemental. It had stopped simply being weather and had become instead a declaration, the mountain asserting its total authority over everything below it, over the fragile human presumption that a path existed, that direction existed, that any world existed beyond the immediate howling white. The fire held. Silas had built it with enough skill and fuel to outlast the night, and he tended it with quiet vigilance, adding wood in careful increments, adjusting the airflow by angling flat stones at the fire's edges with the systematic care of someone who understood combustion as engineering. Evelyn had fallen into a half-sleep, leaning against the stone wall with her coat drawn up around her shoulders, when the temperature dropped suddenly enough to wake her. The fire had dipped, and she was cold, deeply, bone-centrally cold, in the way you get cold when your core temperature begins to actually fall, not just the surface of your skin. She sat up and found Silas watching her from across the fire with the focused attention of a person who had been monitoring her condition. "Your lips are going blue," he said, without drama. "I'm fine," she said, which was not quite true. He stood up, one long, seamless movement, and crossed to his pack, pulling from it a buffalo hide so large it was nearly a blanket, cured and heavy and smelling of wood smoke and pine. He brought it to her side and settled it around her shoulders without any of the awkwardness she might have expected, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone managing a situation. "Thank you," she said. He did not return to his side of the fire. He sat beside her instead, close enough that the heat of his body, and there was a remarkable amount of it, she noticed, a deep animal warmth that radiated through even the thick hide, reached her on the left side, while the fire reached her on the right. She was warm within minutes. She was also, she noticed with some private amusement, at herself, acutely aware of his presence. Not in a frightened way, not in an uncertain way, simply in the way you become aware of something very large and very still that is positioned close to you, a sense of weight and solidity, and, underneath that, a gentleness that was expressed through the fact of his deliberate stillness. He was careful not to crowd her. He was careful to leave space. It was, she thought, the behavior of someone who understood exactly how large he was and worked constantly to ensure that his size never became someone else's burden. An hour passed. The storm outside continued its monologue. She had been drifting again, very nearly asleep, when she felt something slip. A small sound, the soft metallic whisper of a chain, and then the minute shift of Silas beside her as he reached, automatically, to catch something that had fallen. She opened her eyes. In the firelight, she saw it clearly. A locket. Gold. Real gold, not plate. The real warm depth of it unmistakable even in low light, on a chain fine enough to belong to a jeweler's window, rather than a mountain man's coat. It had slipped from whatever inner pocket held it and was now resting in his large palm, and he was looking at it with an expression she had never seen on his face before. He was looking at it like it was the last piece of something broken. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to see." He looked up, and because she was a woman who did not pretend, she said, "Is that your wife?" A long pause. Then, she was. Was. Past tense. The word settled in the space between them with all its terrible weight. "I'm so sorry," Evelyn said, and she meant it. He looked back at the locket. Then, slowly, he opened it. He held it toward the firelight so she could see. Inside was a portrait, miniature, exquisitely painted, the kind that cost more than most people made in a year. A woman with dark auburn hair and a soft, specific smile. Beautiful. Clearly educated, clearly from a world of considerable means. Beside the portrait, on the other side of the locket's hinge, was not a lock of hair or a pressed flower as she would have expected. It was a paper, folded many times to fit the tiny space, and when she looked more closely at its edge where the fold had worn thin, she could see the unmistakable fine lines of a blueprint. She said nothing. He closed the locket. Her name was Catherine, he said. She died of consumption in the spring of 1882. We had been married 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. She was, he stopped. Then, simply, she was extraordinary. I believe you, Evelyn said. The drawing, she said, gently, after a moment. In the locket. He glanced at her. It's a building, she said. I could see the elevation lines. He said nothing. You designed it? Another long silence. Yes, he said at last. What is it? He looked at the fire. It's where we're going, he said. And then he said nothing more. And she, who had learned tonight that some silences were not emptiness but fullness, the kind that hold more than words can, did not push. She settled against the stone wall, her shoulder 2 inches from his, the buffalo hide warm around them both, and she let the fire and the mountain and the storm carry them through the night. The storm broke at dawn. It broke cleanly, one of those abrupt mountain endings where the clouds simply cease, the wind simply stops, and the world is left in the aftermath of itself, absolute, crystalline, and impossibly heartbreakingly still. Evelyn woke to silence. After the long orchestral violence of the night, the silence was so total it felt almost like a sound of its own, a presence rather than an absence, the mountain catching its breath. Silas was already awake. He was standing at the edge of the overhang, looking up at the sky, his breath pluming slowly in the cold air. The first light was coming in from the east, turning the snowfields below them into something that pulsed between gold and white, and in that light his silhouette was something the old painters would have recognized, monumental, still, a human figure set against the infinite mountain. It's done, he said, without turning. We move in an hour. She had thought, when she'd accepted his offer on the platform, that she understood what hard travel meant. She had traveled in poor weather, on poor roads, in poor circumstances. She was not, she had believed, someone who overestimated herself. She had, as it turned out, never climbed a mountain. Not like this. The trail, if it could be called that Silas knew his way up, was not a trail at all in any conventional sense. It was a sequence of choices, a particular angling of footfall here, a handhold on exposed granite there, a crawl through a tight chimney of rock that opened onto a ledge, a traverse of a snow slope at an angle she would never have guessed held safe footing. He went first on every difficult section, and on every difficult section he reached back to her. Not dramatically, not with explanation. Simply, hand out, palm up, steady. They climbed for 3 hours. The world below them disappeared long before the world above them appeared. They spent a long, disorienting time in the cloud layer itself, where visibility dropped to 20 feet, and the air was so wet it coated everything in fine crystals of ice, and she could not see where they had come from, or where they were going, only Silas moving steadily ahead of her, and the granite under her gloved hands, solid and real. Her lungs hurt. Her legs were made entirely of fire. Silas, she called, her voice tight in the thin air. He stopped. He turned, looking back at her, with that calm, assessing expression. Not impatient, never impatient. Simply checking. I need a moment, she managed. Yes, he said. He came back to her, and he stood beside her on the narrow ledge while she breathed, and the cloud moved around them like a slow river, and she pressed her hand flat against the stone face of the mountain and breathed. I am not quitting, she said, because it needed to be said. I know, he said. I'm merely resting, he said. Yes, she looked at him. He was looking outward, into the cloud, with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the careful neutral he wore in town, not the measured utility he wore on the trail. Something quieter and deeper. Anticipation, she realized. The look of someone approaching something beloved. You love it up here, she said, and it was not a question. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I love what's at the top of it. She waited. "You'll see," he said. 10 more minutes." She stood up. 10 minutes. She agreed. The cliff face they came to at the end seemed, for a moment, like the end of everything. A vertical wall of granite that rose straight up and offered nothing. Then Silas put his hand on the surface, and she saw it. The steps. Cut into the stone, not roughly, not accidentally, but with precision, with care, each riser exactly the same height, each tread exactly the same depth, worn smooth by years of use and yet still perfectly engineered. They were nearly invisible in the face of the cliff, slightly offset from the vertical plane, visible only if you knew exactly where to look and at exactly what angle. "You cut these?" she said. "Yes." "How long did that take?" "A summer," he said simply. "Come." She followed him up the steps. 20 steps, 23, 27, and then she stepped off the last stair, and the world changed. She had no other language for it. The world simply, completely changed. One step she was in the cold gray cloud, the frozen mountain at her back, and the howling winter world below. The next, warmth. Not the warmth of a fire or a room or a coat. The warmth of air, of atmosphere, of an entire small world that existed at a different temperature than everything surrounding it. She stopped. She stood completely still, and she looked. The valley was not large, perhaps a quarter mile across and half a mile long, cradled in the arms of 3 great granite peaks, like a secret held between sleeping giants. But within those arms, green, green. In December, in the high Cascades, in the dead of winter, green. Mosses and ferns and grasses she had no names for, all improbably, impossibly alive, all fed by the steam that rose from a dozen places across the valley floor, where natural hot springs pressed up through the rock and breathed their warmth into the enclosed air. Small streams ran warm and clear between the stones. Trees grew at the valley's edge, not the ice-laden pines of the lower slopes, but something taller, cedar and spruce that had never known winter ice, their branches spread and heavy and alive. And in the center of it all, a house. No, not a house. A house did not begin to serve the purpose of the word. She would struggle for weeks to find the right word for what she was seeing, and eventually she would settle on the one he had used in the locket. Palace. Not in the royal sense, not a building of pomp or performance, but in the original, truer sense. A dwelling that expressed the full measure of its builder's vision. It was made of cedar and stone, great blocks of pale granite at its base, rising into cedar walls and cedar beams that had silvered beautifully with age, catching the steamlight of the valley in a way that made them seem almost to glow. It was 3 stories in places, 2 in others, built into and with the contours of the land rather than imposed upon them. And at its center and crown and spine, crystalline quartz, huge slabs of it, set like windows and skylights and decorative columns, catching the indirect winter light that filtered into the valley and throwing it back in slow, shifting prisms that moved across the walls and floors like living things. It was the most beautiful building she had ever seen. Evelyn Mercer, who had not cried on the train platform when her world ended, who had not cried in the jailhouse, who had not cried through the blizzard or the cliff face or the exhaustion of the climb. Evelyn Mercer stood at the top of the hidden stairs and cried. Not from sadness, from the sheer, overwhelming, unexpected surprise of beauty when you had stopped expecting it. Silas stood beside her. He said nothing. He simply stood beside her and let her cry, and looked at his house with that quiet, anticipatory expression, and after a long moment he said, very softly, "Welcome home." The interior of the house was more extraordinary than the exterior. She understood this within the first 30 seconds. Standing in the entrance hall, a soaring space whose ceiling was open to a row of quartz skylight panels above, filling the room with that slow, shifting, prismatic light. The walls were cedar, fragrant still after years, hung with nothing but the natural grain of the wood, which was itself so beautiful that art would have been redundant. The floor was flat stone, a dark, close-grained basalt cut and fitted with such precision that the seams were barely visible. It was warm underfoot, she realized, and she looked down in confusion. "Hot spring water," Silas said from behind her. It runs through channels in the subfloor. Before it reaches the pools in the east wing, it heats the stone. She stared at him. Radiant floor heating, she said, in a voice she barely recognized as her own. Yes, he said. In 1888. The Romans used a version of it, he said, without apparent pride, the way he might note that a mountain had existed before he climbed it. I adapted the principle. The spring maintains a consistent temperature year-round. It works well. She moved through the house slowly, room by room, and with each room she felt something shift further in her understanding, not of the building, but of the man who had built it. The library was first. 3 walls, floor to ceiling, shelved in cedar and filled with books. Engineering, architecture, geology, philosophy, literature, mathematics, medicine. Not collections for display, but working libraries. Spines cracked, pages marked, volumes pulled and replaced at odd angles that told of constant use. She pulled one at random, The Elements of Architecture by Sir Henry Wotton, 1624, and found the margins dense with notes in that precise, architectural hand she had seen on the jailhouse register. She put it back and pulled another, and another. Every margin was full. Past the library was the drafting room, a large work table of heavy cedar, lit from above by a long quartz skylight that threw clean, even light across the surface. And on the table, she stopped in the doorway, blueprints, dozens of them, hundreds. Rolled in varying states of completion, laid flat under stone weights, pinned to boards along the walls. Buildings of every kind, bridges, libraries, houses, civic buildings, mills, she noted, with a complicated feeling, mills, churches, observatories, all in that same precise, extraordinary hand. Some were labeled. Some were dated. The earliest she could find was 1871. He had been 17 years old. She found him in the kitchen, which was its own marvel, built around the largest hot spring in the valley, with a series of stone channels that functioned as a perpetual hearth, capable of maintaining multiple temperatures simultaneously. He was making tea with the same systematic care he brought to everything. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "You built all of it yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Some of the heavy stonework I had help with. Trappers, initially, before I closed the lower trail. I paid well." He set 2 mugs on the table. "Sit." She sat. "You're an architect," she said. "Not a question." "I was," he said. "You still are," she said. "I've just spent an hour in your work. The tense you're using is wrong." He set down his mug. He looked at her across the cedar table, in the warm kitchen, in the impossible hidden valley, with the steam rising from the spring channels and the quartz light moving slowly across the walls. He looked at her for a long time, and she looked back. And this time, when the corner of his mouth moved, he did not stop it. He let himself smile. It was a small smile, careful, slightly unused, the way a door is stiff when it hasn't been opened in a long time. But it was real, and it changed his face entirely. Winter settled around the valley like a held breath. Below the peaks, the world was locked in the hardest December the Cascades had seen in a generation. Trappers went home and stayed there. Trails became impassable. The town of Timberline Station turned inward, surviving, waiting. The mountains were enormous and white and absolute. Inside the valley, none of this reached them. Inside the valley, the ferns grew, the springs breathed, the light moved through the quartz and played across the cedar floors. And 2 strangers, bound by a 5-minute ceremony and 12 cents and a leap of faith, discovered, slowly and carefully, the strange and particular geography of each other. They established a rhythm within the first week, as people who share a space inevitably do. Silas rose before dawn, always, moving through the house with a quietness remarkable for a man of his size. She could not hear his footsteps on the warm stone floors, only the occasional distant sound of a door or the morning fire being encouraged. He spent his early hours in the drafting room, which she understood now was his thinking space, the place where the part of his mind that never truly rested went to work, while the rest of him was still waking. She rose at dawn, built the kitchen fire higher. The spring channels kept the kitchen warm, but she liked the wood fire, liked the ritual of it, and prepared breakfast with the systematic efficiency she applied to everything. She had cataloged the stores within the first 2 days: smoked meat, dried fish, root vegetables, flour, dried fruit, salt, coffee, and a range of preserved goods that represented months of careful planning. He had not been exaggerating when he told the general store he could provide. He had, in fact, been understating. They ate breakfast together, always. It was their first real daily conversation, the morning meal, at the cedar table, while the quartz light came in slowly from above, and the steam curled up from the spring channels, and the valley outside was green and quiet. At first, the conversations were careful, practical, what needed doing, what the weather was telling them, what the stores required, safe, structural topics. Then one morning, in the second week, Silas set down his coffee cup and said, without preamble, "My name is not Silas." She put down her own cup. She looked at him. "My name is Julian," he said. "Julian Arthur Vance. I was the principal architect of the Vance and Morrison firm in Boston. I held the commission for the new public library in 1880, the Harrington Estate in 81, and the East Wing of the Massachusetts Institute, the one they finished in 83. He said this without inflection, without pride or self-pity, simply as information being properly conveyed. After Catherine died, I could not remain in the city. I tried for 6 months. I could not go past the building sites. I could not sit in the offices. Everything in the city was a memory in stone, so I left. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then, "Julian Vance," she said slowly. "I've heard that name. My father, he spoke of the Harrington Commission. He said the architect was exceptional. Said the load-bearing innovation in the east facade was something the engineering journals were writing about." Something moved across Julian's face. Something raw and old and complicated. "Catherine helped with the calculations for the load distribution," he said quietly. She could have been an engineer in another world, in another era. She had the mind for it." A pause. "I never published those papers without crediting her. The journals wouldn't put a woman's name to engineering mathematics. I refused to submit without it, so they never ran." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "You gave up the publication to preserve her contribution," she said. "She did the work," Julian said simply. "Why would I give anyone a reason to forget that?" She looked at him across the table. This man who had buried his name in the snow and lived in animal hides so that no one would expect anything of him, and she felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was the feeling of a long-held tension releasing, the feeling of recognizing something you did not know you had been looking for. "Julian," she said. He looked up. "I think you should show me the drafting room. Properly. All of it." A pause. "Why?" he asked. "Because," she said, "whatever you have been doing up here alone, in the cold, for 5 years, I think you've been doing it for yourself. And I think it's time to consider doing it for more than that." He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. The valley breathed outside. And then Julian Vance, who had been Scruffy Silas, who had been the town beast, who had carried her trunk over an impossible mountain without complaint, said, "After breakfast." And she knew something had shifted. The drafting room became their shared space. This happened gradually, organically, the way all real collaborations happen, not with a plan or an announcement, but through the accumulation of small, necessary acts. The first day she simply stood at his elbow, and he explained the drawings to her, walking her through the progression of his work, with the same precision and care she imagined he had once used with students or clients in Boston. She listened with total attention. She asked questions that he had not expected. Not the questions of someone being politely educated, but the questions of someone whose mind was engaging with the material at its actual level. Organizational questions, logistical questions, the questions of a person who was simultaneously mapping the work onto the real world of material, labor, and sequence. By the third day, she had begun making notes. Small ones at first, observations in her neat, upright hand on the corner of papers he had finished with, cataloging the variations in design across the years, noting when a technique appeared and when it evolved. She was not redesigning. She was not commenting on his choices. She was mapping the work, building the index that the work itself had always lacked. Julian watched her do this without comment, but she noticed him slowing down when he passed behind her, pausing, reading. At the end of the first week, he asked to see her notes. She handed them over. He read them standing at the drafting table, and she watched his face, and she saw it. the same thing she had seen the first morning he smiled, only larger. The slow, wondering recognition that something he had lived with for so long he could no longer see it clearly was being seen, freshly and accurately, by someone else. "You've organized 5 years of work into a coherent sequence," he said. "There was already a sequence," she said. "I simply made it visible." "How?" "I traced the problem you kept returning to," she said. She moved to stand beside him, pointing. "Here, the load distribution question that you were working on in '84. You set it aside in '85 when you started the Valley House, but you returned to it in '86, in a different form. Here, in the bridge calculations. And then again in '87, and you solved it here, in the foundation work for the East Wing. You just didn't know you'd solved it because you weren't looking across the whole body of work." Julian was very still. "You solved a problem you didn't know you'd been solving," she continued, "because the work was scattered across 5 years of isolation. If it had been organized, cataloged the way a proper firm catalogs its work, you would have seen the solution 2 years earlier." He looked at the papers. He looked at her. "What else?" he said, and his voice was different, alive in a way it had not been before, the voice of a person who has been in a quiet room and suddenly hears music. "What else do you see?" They worked until midnight that night, and the next night, and the night after that. He pulled drawings, and she organized them. He explained context, and she built the catalog. She asked questions that pulled him deeper into problems he had set aside, and he answered with a fluency that built as the days went on, the fluency of a man who had not been unintelligent in 5 years of isolation, but who had not had anyone to think with. There is a difference. She understood this. Intelligence in isolation turns inward, refines itself, until it becomes very precise and very narrow. Intelligence in dialogue expands. It finds dimensions it had forgotten were there. One evening in the 3rd week, Julian looked up from the drafting table and said, without preamble, "I want to build a new wing." She looked up from the catalog she was assembling. "West Wing?" she asked. "You have the foundation laid. You noticed that. First day, I noticed you had started it and stopped. What happened?" "I didn't know what it was for," he said. "I had the structure, but not the purpose." He paused. "I think I know now." She waited. "A proper library," he said. "Not just shelves. A designed space. Light from the northwest for reading. Study alcoves built into the quartz panels. A central hearth and a catalog room." He looked at her. A catalog room. She understood. "For the work," she said. "For the work," he confirmed. A pause. "Will you help me design it?" he asked. Evelyn Mercer looked at the man across the drafting table. This man who had been a beast and was in fact a genius, who had been her necessity and was in fact her equal, who had built something extraordinary in the mountains because grief had driven him there, and who was now, for the first time in years, building towards something rather than away from it. She looked at him. And she said, "I thought you'd never ask." Spring came to the valley as it always did, not all at once, but in a conversation between the warming light above and the perpetual warmth below, the old ferns uncurling new growth at the edge of the springs, the moss deepening from winter silver to summer green, the cedar trees releasing their stored scent into air that was finally soft. The lower world was still cold when the valley bloomed. This was always how it was here, the hidden kingdom running its own calendar, its own seasons, answering to a logic of warmth and stone and spring water, rather than the rigid December to March that governed the world below. Evelyn stood on the high ridge, the same ridge she had climbed in a blizzard 5 months before, and looked out over the white peaks and the distant, barely visible thread of the valley below where Timberline Station sat, and breathed. Behind her, the new West Wing was half built. She could hear it, the deliberate ring of the mallet on the stone chisel, the sound of Julian working, the rhythm she had come to know, the way you come to know a heartbeat, the rhythm of a man building in his own element, purposeful and alive. They had worked through the winter on the plans together, her organizational clarity, and his structural genius combining in a way she had no prior framework for. It was not the division of labor she had known in her father's mill, where the thinking and the doing were rigidly separated. It was something more fluid, more mutual, more honest than that. She told him what the space needed to do. He told her how the stone and light and water could be made to do it. And together, they found the specific, irreducible form that served both the function and the beauty. 3 weeks before spring, they had broken ground. Julian had handed her the first chisel. She had looked at it and then at him. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "Place it on the marked line," he said. "Hold it at 15 degrees. Don't hold too tightly. Let the weight of the mallet do the work." She positioned it. She struck. The stone gave a clean, resonant ring, and a small chip fell away. Julian looked at the mark and nodded once, the precise single nod of a craftsman assessing work. "Good angle," he said. She had worked alongside him every day since. Her hands were rough now, in ways they had never been before. Real work rough, tool rough, stone rough. She wore it with a satisfaction she would not have predicted. The satisfaction of work that left marks, that built something permanent, that existed in 3 dimensions rather than the 2-dimensional plane of ledger books and account balances. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood on the platform with 12 cents in a suitcase, watching a train disappear around a mountain bend. She barely recognized her. Behind her, the mallet strokes stopped. She heard his footsteps on the stone path. She knew his footsteps, as well as she knew anything about him now. The particular cadence of a large man who moved carefully, deliberately, and he came to stand beside her on the ridge. He was still dusty from the work. His hands were stone gray with granite dust, and there was a smudge of it along his jaw where he had pushed back his hair. He was not wearing the animal hides anymore. He had not for months, had taken to wearing the work clothes she had helped him sew from the heavy cloth he kept in the storeroom. He still wore his beard, but trimmed now, the frost long gone from it. He looked, she thought, like himself. He stood beside her and looked at the view. They were both quiet for a long time. "The trappers," he said finally. "Morrow told me last month that there's talk below. People have seen the steam, from the right angle in winter. They're starting to wonder. Will they find the stairs?" she asked. "Not unless someone shows them." He paused. "I've been thinking about the upper trail. There's a section before the cliff where the path could be redirected. If the existing trail were to be obscured, very carefully, and a new false trail were to be—" "You want to build a decoy trail," she said. "I want to protect the valley," he said. She nodded slowly. "I can draw the plan, the organization of it, which way the false trail should angle, how far it should go before it ends at something impassable." "Yes," he said. "That's what I need." She looked at him. "Julian," she said. He looked at her. There were things she had not said yet. There were things between them that had grown in the long winter months, slowly, like the ferns at the hot spring's edge, not forced, not performed, but grown, the way real things grow, toward the light, at their own pace. She was not afraid of them. She had stopped being afraid of most things. "I would like," she began, and stopped. He waited, the way he always waited. "I would like for this to be real," she said. "Not a convenience, not an arrangement of necessity." She looked at him steadily. "It may already be, on my part. But I thought you should know that I am choosing this. Not because I had 12 cents and nowhere else to go. I'm choosing it now, with full information and no other pressures, freely." Julian Vance, who had been Scruffy Silas, who had been the beast of Timberline Station, who had carried her trunk over an impossible mountain and built her a kingdom of quartz and cedar, looked at her. And then he did something she had never seen him do before. He took her hand, carefully, the way he did everything, the way a man holds something he understands to be extraordinary. He held her hand. "I am also choosing this," he said, in case there was any question. The valley bloomed around them. The spring below the peaks was still weeks away. But up here, in the hidden kingdom, the green was already deep, and the springs already singing, and the new west wing already rising in its clean lines against the cedar and quartz of the main house. From below, the world had no idea. From below, the mountains were simply mountains, white and impassable and absolute, keeping their secrets the way mountains have always kept secrets. But up above the cloud line, in the geothermal valley that the season couldn't touch, 2 people who had each arrived at the bottom of everything stood on a high ridge in the spring light and held each other's hands, and looked out at the world that had cast them out, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, rich. Not in the way they had each once been rich, in the only way that actually endures. Years later, when the trappers and the map makers had long since stopped looking for the valley that breathed steam in winter, there was a story that circulated in the low country around Timberline Station. The story was that somewhere above the cloud line, up past the ice walls and the false trails, up past the storm line and the granite cliffs, there was a place where winter never fully reached, where a woman of considerable sharpness and a man of remarkable brilliance had built a library that could have stood in any city in the country, and a house that redefined what a house was for, where blueprints lined the walls, and catalogs filled the shelves, and the quartz caught every shift of the mountain light, and held it, turning it into something slow and golden and permanent. No one ever found it. But the story persisted, the way the best stories persist, not because they can be proven, but because they answer something true in the people who hear them. That love is built, that wealth is made, that the world will sometimes take everything from you, and in doing so, unintentionally, clear the ground for something more extraordinary than what was lost. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the most improbable union between a woman with 12 cents and a man the whole town called a beast is also the most perfect one. Evelyn and Julian never came back down. And the hidden kingdom endured, and the ferns grew, and the spring water sang, and the quartz caught the light. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Oh my goodness, we made it through. If you are still here, if you have walked with Evelyn from that frozen train platform all the way to the top of those mountains, then you are exactly the kind of soul this channel was made for. And I want you to know something. I am so, so grateful for you. This story, this love, this journey, this hidden kingdom, it exists because of people like you who believe that a great story deserves to be told well and deserves to be listened to fully. Now, before you go, and please, please don't go yet, I need just 30 seconds of your time. If this story moved you, if it warmed you, if it made you cry a little, if it made you feel something real, please do one small thing for me right now. Hit that like button. It tells the world that stories like this matter, that slow love and hidden worth and the quiet dignity of people who have survived hard things, these stories matter. And every like helps more people find us. And if you are not yet subscribed to Alea Duke Stories, oh friend, you have no idea what you are missing. This channel is dedicated to stories that take their time, stories that breathe, that build, that mean something. Every week we bring you a new Duke story, a new journey, a new pair of souls finding their way to each other against every odd the world can throw at them. Subscribe right now, hit that bell, make sure you never miss a story. Because I promise you that every story I bring you will be worth your time. And to those of you who have been here from the beginning, you know who you are. You are the ones who leave comments that make me cry at my desk. You are the ones who say, I was having the worst week and this story saved it. You are the ones who remind me why we do this. Thank you. From the very bottom of my heart. This is Alea Duke Stories, and I will see you in the next one.